busy day today. So good morning, everyone. And this is a hybrid event. So to our colleagues and friends who are joining us online from elsewhere, especially from Europe and Asia, good afternoon or good evening. My name is Sebastien Peyrouse. I'm the Director of the Central Asia Program and a research professor here at the IRIS. So welcome all to the Central Asia program. I must say that with a real emotion that I'm opening this security workshop today, because I mean, since the creation of our program more than 10 years ago in 2012, we have organized this security workshop every year. And unfortunately, we had to interrupt it during the pandemic. So during 3 years, we didn't have it in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So we're so happy to relaunch it today. This workshop is, I mean, particularly important to us because in a way, it materializes one of the main goals of our program, which is to discuss many different topics on contemporary Central Asia with people working in very different circles in academia, of course, but in think tanks, so for the government, for civil society organizations, in international organizations, and so on. So we're going to discuss many topics today. We'll have a first panel devoted to how Putin's war in Ukraine impacts Central Asia. One also of the key events last year was the takeover of power by the Taliban in Afghanistan, which raised many discussions. And we're going to address in the second panel the impact of the situation in Afghanistan on neighboring countries, so on Central Asia. It is also essential to consider the domestic factors, how they impact the stability and the development of Central Asian countries. So we're going to have a panel on that. For obvious reasons, we won't be able to deal with many questions, but we thought it would be important to discuss a specific question or maybe a specific event and how it reflects or how it illustrates the situation in each of the countries of the region. And finally, the geopolitical and domestic context in Central Asia raises many questions for foreign actors, and especially about the role of the United States, taking into account here the engagement of many other foreign actors in the region, which might have some complementary or contradictory interests. So this will be the topic of our last panel. So, and to discuss all these topics, we have brought together today no less than 15 of the best specialists on Central Asia. So I would really like to thank all of you, and a special thank you to those who are going to speak from abroad today, with for some of them a big time difference. I mean, we have some speakers who are based in Europe, in Central Asia, in Turkey, and even one, Karen Ojana from Australia. So thank you, really. It's, of course, a hybrid event, which gives a possibility to our friends and colleagues who are based abroad to listen and participate in the discussion. So for those of you who join us online, please don't hesitate to send your question in the chat box. I would like to thank Marlene and all the IRIS and the Central Asia program staff, and especially Ms. Kabatova for their big contribution to organize this event today. And now, so before our first panel, we are very, very privileged today to have an extremely well-known keynote speaker, Professor Alexander Cooley. Alexander is the Keynote Professor of Political Science and Vice Provost for Academic Centers and Libraries at Barnard College at Columbia University, and an Academy Adjunct faculty member at Chatham House. From 2015 to 2021, he served as the 15th director of Columbia University Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. Professor Cooley's research examines how external actors, including emerging powers, international organizations, multinational companies, NGOs, and Western neighbors of grand corruption, have influenced the development, governance, and sovereignty of the former Soviet states with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. He's the author and was the editor of 8 academic books, including the very famous one, Dictators Without Borders, Power and Might in Central Asia, and that he authored with, he co-authored with John Shaw, and more recently, Exit from Hegemony, the Unraveling of the American Global Order, which was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, and that he co-authored with Daniel Nexler. In addition to his academic research, Professor Cooley serves on several international advisory boards engaged with the region, and has testified for the United States Congress and Helsinki Commission. Alexander Cooley's opinion pieces have appeared in many places, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs, and his research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Open Society Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And he earned his A and PhD from Columbia University. So Alex's presentation today will be on Eurasia. We made the regional reports of Russia's war in Ukraine. So Alex, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Wow, if I could only switch the screen share so smoothly, like, like on my own, I still can't do that. Thank you, Sebastien. It's just an absolute honor and a privilege to be here. It's become sort of commonplace to say it's so nice to be in person, but really the space here I associate not only with tracking developments in the region, from learning from some of the most insightful experts, observers, researchers. What you and the rest of the GW community have done here is really remarkable and extraordinary. I think it's a testimony to its endurance that we're back here and excited about it. I won't comment whether it's a testimony to your judgment to have me as the keynote speaker, but we'll see about that in terms of the Q&A. This was really interesting and in some ways tough for me, because I had when the war started, I was actually on leave. I haven't had a leave in a while, and I was trying to sort of put everything that was happening within some sort of comparative and analytical context, and particularly in light of some of the work that I was doing with Dan that you mentioned on the reshaping of the international order, and thinking about where Central Asia may or may not fit into these into these trends. I think initially what stunned all of us was the sort of unprecedented Western unity that we saw in the outbreak of the war. Really, in all of these dimensions that I think surprised some of us. I'm sure it surprised certain people in the Kremlin. The Ukrainians surprised all of us, or maybe not all of us, but so-called experts, their heroic bravery and resilience in fight. But I think it's worth just thinking about some of the dimensions here, right? The unprecedented condemnation and sequence of sanctions, coordinated responses. How is it that the US Treasury, the European Central Bank, together announced the freezing of Russian assets immediately? A whole series of financial individual sanctions, including Nord Stream 2 cancellation, partners that had never imposed export controls before coming on board, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Switzerland even joining the sanctions regime. Europe's embracing of 7 million Ukrainian refugees, right? Especially given the fact that 10 years before, observers were talking about the end of Europe specifically because of exogenous shocks generated by refugee flows, right? That was a big factor. And countries individually announced military resupply for Ukraine, with increasing sophistication and weaponry. NATO agrees to admit Finland and Sweden, just like that. And then this mass corporate pullout of Russia. And so this is what Dan and I talked about, that this was really the strength of the US liberal hegemonic cartel in crisis. You see, when the West wants to get together and do something concertedly, they have a number of different tools and processes, actors and networks to mobilize. I say all this because while this is going on, I think we're having a much needed conversation and awakening about the lenses that blinded us to what Russia was going to do, and also the Ukrainian response. I think calls for decolonizing the field, recognizing the agency and the real accomplishments and the local factors in places that we reflexively, perhaps irresponsibly, call the post-Soviet space. These are incredibly important contributions. And thinking about the colonial project as unwinding over a series of different markers and events, I also find to be analytically very important. But I would also say that I think in some ways we conflated the project of thinking about why we got the lead up to the war so wrong with our assumptions about how every country involved in the region might react to them. Yeah, like our observations about Western unity, I think, started to create assumptions about the conditions and the dilemmas, the balancing acts, the very real excruciating choices that a lot of the Eurasian states, governments, and actors within them had to make. So in these remarks today, and I apologize for their, in some ways, lack of structured coherence, I want to make really about 4 or 5 points, maybe provocations, maybe observations, maybe they're all wrong. But just to open up, I think, a dialogue, a discussion, and what is a group that has enormous expertise here. And so I do want to talk about the Central Asian stance towards the war. I want to talk about the Western opprobrium towards Russia. I want to talk about the repurposing of regional institutions and agreements, why different states across Eurasia have reacted differently, and also, of course, what's a Central Asian conference without a comment on a Russia-China meeting and summit. So we'll go through all of that and in pretty expeditious fashion. I think everyone's familiar with some version of this map. This is the map of the countries that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine in March at the United Nations. And numerically, the blue states that condemned the attack are overwhelming. But the abstentions that we see, the 30-some abstentions, the single-digit support of Russia, do account for almost half of humanity, right? When you think about all the countries, certainly China, South Asia, Southeast Asia, certain parts of Africa, and so. And so part of the question is, well, why is that? I found the Central Asian stances to be understandable and actually understandable in terms of a legal position. And actually they mirrored what had happened before in 2014, when there was a similar vote at the UN to condemn the annexation of Crimea. It was a combination of abstentions, formal neutrality, and not voting, right? Refusing even to sort of cast the vote, sort of be involved. I think the positions were reversed. The countries that didn't vote in 2014 abstained and so. I think the reasons why you have these abstentions vary, and it's important to understand that, right? There's not one kind of response here, right? And I think that also gives us a potential set of insights in some specific cases. right? China now is promoting its 4-point peace plan, list of principles, even though it's, in essence, it's supporting politically its revisionist strategic partner, as we saw yesterday. It's avoiding sanctions, or at least avoiding detection on really big red lines in sanctions. It's extracting concessions from Russia. It's using this to try and legitimize its own potential leadership role, especially in its posturing vis-a-vis the South. India, I think a really interesting mix of factors. Energy opportunism, right? Indian purchases of Russian oil are up 14-fold over the previous year. I think geopolitical hedging, I think a kind of a belief that great powers don't actively pick sides in a multipolar world, right? They try and keep doors of engagement open, as well as the very real institutional ties and domestic legacies in certain parts of the Indian foreign policy community with Russia. Let's go to South Africa. Here, it's a question more of a resonance of anti-imperialism. You say, well, hang on, isn't the imperial power invading? But yes, but the resonance in Africa of the Soviet Union being perceived as an anti-colonial power is very real. Questions about NATO expansion, the kind of destabilizing aspects of democratization, legacies of the non-alignment movement. All in all, 17 African countries voted to abstain from condemning Russia. So it doesn't come as a surprise that. Oh, a final point I want to make. I think the regional fallout of the war, even though we saw this as this is just like a unique, unprecedented, right, kind of act, fundamentally destabilizing, post-Cold War European architecture. In Central Asia, this is a region that had endured several exogenous shocks, many of them involving conflict within a short period of time, right? And so just free to talk about in the last 2 years, the final US withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? The sort of symbolism, Russian and Chinese-led security and economic fora, now being the main formal and informal ways of pulling the region together. January 2022, Takaev's consolidation of power and this successful CSTO intervention, right? In itself, incredibly important, right? The CSTO had never intervened before, even though it had been asked on several occasions by the Kyrgyz Republic, by Armenia, and so forth. And then, of course, February 2022. So this is a region that had endured what was perceived as a number of exogenous shocks coming in. Now, in terms of US policy, I think it's fair to say that US standing is not what it was 20 years before, when the US successfully set up a set of military bases and supply agreements and refueling agreements across the region to assist in its activities in Afghanistan. Back then, both Russia and China reluctantly, in some ways, and certainly self-servingly, supported the US. Vladimir Putin called George W. Bush, offered his assistance, offered the base in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. You can argue whether they were his to sort of offer up. And he talked about the common civilizational struggle, right? China also went along, and China's main concession was grafting on its campaign in Xinjiang onto this lens of the global war on terror. Colleagues have really shown it. So when the withdrawal was happening and negotiations were ongoing over a set of sort of logistics sites to just fly a few drones over for surveillance purposes, and Russia, by all accounts, put pressure on the Central Asian states to deny this, to agree this, and I think Putin at some point even said that China agrees with us. To me, it was an important marker about not only the U.S. withdrawing, but I think some of the ordering dimensions in the region too, right? That there were enough levers now that Russia and China had be able to pressure the Central Asian states not to agree to what was a relatively, I think, a sort of simple request. I think when we talk about Kazakhstan, and I'm curious to get your own perspectives here, I think we emphasized a lot some of the very real protests and outrage, the mobilization of civil society that we saw, effort actually that raised humanitarian assistance. That was then shipped off to Ukraine. And we also tended to see, or look for, I would say, Takayev's defiance against Putin. And so this particular episode in the St. Petersburg Economic Forum drew a lot of attention to this, right? Putin gets unexpected pushback from ally over war in Ukraine. And this was what President Tokayev talked about, how they don't favor, they won't recognize Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics as independent states. What didn't get covered in the same speech, rereading it, was that he said the same thing about Kosovo in the same speech. And he also said the same thing about Abkhazia. The Kazakhstan position had been consistent, right? To not recognize separatist states without UN authorization, right? So to me, this was more, it's sort of emblematic of Tokayev sort of threading the line in what was a very difficult situation for him, right? But I think it's perfectly and consistently with the previous positions. The Economist Intelligence Unit, the FICO, came out with this really interesting infographic a couple of days ago. And their point is that 1 year after the war, there's an increasing number of countries that are siding with Russia. And I think in this map, if you look at where Central Asia is, and you look at the other countries that are coded in red, Russia leading or supportive of Russia, this is hardly surprising, right? Central Asian positions on the war are absolutely consistent with where their neighborhood is. So let's go through some of the other kind of points. I think the second kind of issue that comes to mind is what of the outrage against Russia's behavior, the opprobrium. To me, this is one of the more surprising parts of Western unity, is the corporate collapse. Right? It's not complete, but it is significant. And I would judge that this is probably the most successful case of the stigmatization of a country since the apartheid regime in South Africa. Certainly part of the West. When you talk about corporate entities who are forced to withdraw just because their boards and their shareholders say it is impossible for us to remain. The reputational damage and risk is too much. And so hopefully someone will write a tale of this at some point. The midnight emergency board meetings at places like BP or ExxonMobil, not just companies like IKEA and McDonald's that are Western consumption companies, companies with real multi-billion-dollar energy investments that had endured every kind of political risk that there is, especially when you think about BP and the Russian government. No, we're out of here, right? That level of a program. Now you might say, well, this is a fear of shareholder activism. So yes, but that shareholder activism is based on a reputational concern. For a running list, you can go to Yale School of Management at Cisco. This program isn't shared in Central Asia. It is by some actors and even by some elites, but it's also not shared in the developing world, the global South, many parts of Eurasia in general. This is a mashup as reported by Eurasianet, the Central Asian Barometer, on the war attitudes by Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And what we see is pretty even split in Kazakhstan on the war. And in Kyrgyzstan, the proportion of actors who think that the West is responsible is pretty significant. And again, given the Kyrgyz Republic's ties to Russia, migration, the information space, all of these things, the attitudes towards Russian foreign policy in general, this shouldn't come as a surprise. I think more interesting for my argument was not the general vote at the General Assembly, but this was a vote to agree to kick Russia out of the UN Human Rights Council. Right, this is separate than the war. This is their standing in the Human Rights Council. Let's look here, with the exception of Turkmenistan that forgot to vote on this one. Every Central Asian country votes no. They don't abstain. They vote no. Right? And so particularly on this issue of sort of condemning Russia symbolically for its human rights abuses. So that a program is not shared. Moreover, my third point is one of the fundamental concerns that the Central Asian, Eurasian, and other parts of the world have, the impact of economic sanctions. Right? This sanctions regime that was described to me by one official from the region, that there is a sanction regime against Iran. We don't have an exemption the way India, you have granted India an exemption, you haven't granted us an exemption. We now have sanctions for dealing with companies in Xinjiang. Now you're sanctioning Russia. What are we supposed to do? We're a landlocked country. And I thought it was a very interesting and telling way of phrasing the dilemma, the connectivity dilemma for some of the Central Asian states. I think none of the post-Soviet states having joined sanctions is a story, perhaps not in Central Asia, but certainly when you think about Georgia. And there are a couple of drivers here. One is self-interest, certainly. The Georgians don't want to unilaterally cede half of their wine industry, a third of their tourist industry, right? But also, I do think there's a sense of sort of, well, where were the sanctions in 2008? Right? Where were the sanctions when Abkhazia and South Ossetia were taken from us and recognized as independent states? Deep concern about the shocks of integration, right? Energy, foodstuffs, compliance risks, can you use mirror cards? What does this mean for Eurasian shipping? And so a very interesting paper that I would recommend for everyone, put out by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development a couple of weeks ago, finds that there is evidence suggestive of intermediated trade via neighboring countries being used to circumvent the sanctions. In other words, the exports of sanctioned goods to members of the Eurasian Economic Union rose by 30% relative to those of other goods. What does that mean? It means re-export through Armenia, through Kyrgyzstan, through Kazakhstan. Countries that are members of the Eurasian Economic Union are also most likely being used for sanctions evasion. That gets me to my next point, and I think maybe one of the more interesting is that Russia and Eurasia, rather than being pulled apart by the war, are actually remixing and re-networking in ways that very few of us anticipate. It involves individuals, companies, and economies. It is the consequence of the repurposing of Russian-led regional architectures, including visa regimes and including that economic organization. And the very fact that the Eurasian Economic Union can be used for this kind of activity, I think, is telling. But of course, the war isn't mentioned at all by the Eurasian Economic Union on the website. If you go on the website and you see what they're doing, their activities, like nothing's happened in the last. Right? Let's talk about migration. So initially, I think there was a wave of analysis that there would be a mass exodus of Central Asian migrants from Russia, especially because the sanctions would impact their ability to send home remittances. There were also deep concerns about forced conscription, right? These stories, these accounts essentially find themselves in the front lines. Threats of losing recent citizenship, certainly the hundreds of thousands of Tajiks that acquired Russian citizenship. But over the last few months, we've seen, I think, a couple of trends that run counter to that. The ruble has remained stable due to central bank capital controls. I think sanctions are having bite in other ways, but the financial sanctions that we thought were going to bring Russia to its knees have not had that effect. And as a result of the war, we're seeing what is, according to the Gadar Institute, the Russian labor market experiencing the most acute shortages it's had since 1993. Right? And in fact, we've seen migration quotas lifted in Uzbekistan, according to one story, for critical industries, construction, and agribusiness. So Russia needs labor. And it strikes me that that is going to only encourage migration to resume on previous trends. This is, I think, one of the most unexpected stories. And this starts from the Russian government banning all of these tech platforms for fears of information security when the war starts, and also in response to sanctions. And this is an infographic of percentage of Russian adults that use Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, PayPal, all of these different platforms. And as a result of both the instability of the war and a lot of these sort of tech companies and products being banned, we had an exodus of hundreds of thousands of Russian IT workers at the time. And the estimate is that 100,000 are still abroad. Right? 100,000 IT workers are still 10% of the labor force. Initially, this is where they went in the first month, according to a hearing in the Russian Duma. They identified 25,000 in Georgia, 20,000 in Turkey, Armenia 20,000, Uzbekistan 3,000. And 1 year on, we see some extraordinary developments. We see in Armenia, Armenian GDP having exploded, up 13% from 2022, 1,300 companies there. Exports to Russia up 3 times, remittances from Armenia to Russia up 4 times. We see IT hubs booming in Central Asia. The Astana hub, right, which is also, I think, quite strategically targeting incubating fintech, along with the Astana International Financial Center. You see the high-tech park in Kyrgyzstan, for so long a relatively quiet place, is now an absolute bustling engine, 270 companies, double the number of the previous year. And in Uzbekistan, its IT park registering over 200% growth last year, revenues up 440%. So what we're seeing is a concerted effort in these places to adopt strategies to attract Western, but not just Western, business outsourcing contracts. And we see the implementations by all of these countries of new residence regimes to facilitate this. 5-year visas, tax-free status in Kazakhstan, digital nomad visas in Kyrgyzstan, and the Tashrush Uzbek relocation. That's wave 1. Now wave 2, mobilization and conscription in September. This is less about IT workers and fleeing academics, and it is about those wanting to avoid mobilization, even though maybe they don't have strong political opinions, positions to do so. And again, let's look at the vectors from this graphic with Novaya Gazeta Europe. Within mobilization being called, over 200,000, probably more, are going. And they're going in routes, again, where you have visa-free travel, right? Again, this is sort of shaping the vectors of their output. This isn't a Central Asian slide, but I sort of call this sort of the tale of 2 clients, 2 allies. I think reactions to what has happened very much depends on the regime security in question here. So I think the Belarus-Armenia comparison is interesting because they are both relatively small states, both viewed Russia as the security ally. And for Lukashenko to understand Lukashenko's active support, not neutrality, active support, right, co-belligerence in this conflict, you have to understand the deals that were made in 2020 with protesters, and the support that he's received from Moscow and the quid pro quo with that involved. But with Mr. Pashinyan, this is the ultimate final straw, I think, of showing that the security partnership with Russia is actually unreliable, right? That so many hopes were vested in this, that Russia would actually protect Armenian interests. There were legal pretexts given before, outside of Nagorno-Karabakh, but even when the fighting went to Armenia proper, Russia was not there. And so this is, so Pashinyan very demonstrably interrupted a meeting of the CSTO. But I think regime politics, as has always been the case, dictates stance towards Russia in the Kyrgyz Republic, in Tajikistan, in Kazakhstan, and the others as well. So let's go to our Russia, China summit, and I saw some good buzz on this. I think Murumar sort of posted this, that there was sort of a statement about Central Asia for the first time. And true enough, there was. And there was also, I find really interesting that paragraph before, and I'll tell you the reason. So yes, the bottom paragraph, the parties are ready to strengthen their mutual coordination to support the Central Asian countries. You know, we don't want color revolutions, we don't want external interference in the affairs. But there's also this paragraph before, the parties note the positive contribution of the CSTO to regional security. They note the potential for the development of cooperation between the CSTO and China in order to ensure peace and stability of the region. Why insert this, right? Why is this in the communique? Sort of very explicit. And I think the answer, going back to a year ago, goes to Xi's statement at his Central Asia summit, where in response, in the wake of all that had happened in Kazakhstan, they released, I think, a very blandly supportive statement of principles for Tokayev in Kazakhstan, firmly opposed, external forces. Kazakhstan should maintain stability, stop violence, strong leadership of Tokayev, and so forth. But there was not a reference to the CSTO in this, right? A lot of people say, well, China doesn't agree with the CSTO, like probably saw this as sort of provocative. My reading, this is just pure speculation, is that the CSTO statement is an attempt to loop the circle. Right? Now, we can argue about sort of different interests and their possible clash in Central Asia, and we've done so, we'll continue to do so. But my thinking of this is one that's what I see is Central Asia, rather than be the cause of potential fallout between Russia and China, it's the arena in which they actually reach mutual accommodations. Right? It's the arena in which their different ordering institutions, whether it's regional architectures, norms, trading spaces, security organizations, if not mutually coordinate, find a way to modus vivendi. Right? So I think the interactions are important. They're not always pursuing the self-interest, but they work them out in Central Asia, right? As opposed to be divided by them in Central. And to me, that's incredibly significant. So to wrap up, how should the US, the EU, other countries navigate a Eurasian region that's being remade? I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to understand the positionality and the dilemmas that Central Asian actors face. The hedging, the neutrality, the sort of impossible pressures that they're facing from Russia, from economic sanctions, from this re-networking, from the uncertainty of the influx of new waves of migration, what that means for stability in their country, for what that means for prices for their citizens, things like real estate markets, foodstuffs. So I would say focus on affirming sovereignty, right? Rather than promoting the democracy aspect of this, that this war should be about defending Ukraine's sovereignty. But this is also neither sufficient nor prescriptive. I think there should be an avoidance, framing this as a West versus Russia. This is what Russia wants to do. And I think it's doing so increasingly successfully in the global South. Right? Once you start buying into the framing of West versus Russia, then all of the other grievances play in. Like this ICC indictment of Putin. By the way, there is one Central Asian country that's signed on to the ICC. It's Tajikistan. And Tajikistan actually was pressured in the campaign about forced returns of Uyghurs, along with Cambodia. I think it was 3 years ago. And they held the line. So I don't think Mr. Putin has to worry about going to Dushanbe. But certainly, I think the normative fallout of the ICC indictment, and I'm all for stigmatizing Mr. Putin, but I wonder how the dynamics are going to play in the global South. I wonder actually whether this is going to sort of enhance this notion that the West is selective about who they indict, and that this is an instrument of geopolitical power as opposed to moral outrage. But anyway, this West versus Russia frame is particularly unhelpful, I think, for the Central Asian and Eurasian states. But in terms of the opportunities, let's think about these new kinds of networks, right? In other words, not just start thinking about new government-to-government relations and sort of affirmations of sovereignty and support, but can we support municipalities? Municipalities that are under strain to cope with these tech workers, to process them, right? To create favorable sort of regimes. Juliet Johnson, in her amazing book about central banks and post-communist studies, has a term that I really like. She calls them wormhole networks, very tightly coupled networks, right? That arise in certain fields of specialty. I think that's the case for IT. When you look at the tech conferences, spaces, interactions that these companies have. And so this is, I think, a strength of the West, right? Having access to such IT wormholes. I think we need to develop a strategy for dealing with Russian exiles, and especially Russian media, right? It doesn't have to be a Cold War strategy, but there needs to be a strategy. There's too many Russian exiles in the information space and in the knowledge sphere that don't have alternatives, that don't have options except for Germany, right? And I think this is a strategic miscalculation. And then finally, I think within these spaces, these transformative spaces, this is a chance for us to do what we do best, which is to cultivate our own global educational networks and partnerships, right? And really contribute to what is this sort of sudden reopening of the world. So I don't know if Eurasia has actually been remade, but I do think that some of the assumptions that we have perhaps require some recalibration and some thinking. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to answer. Sure. Yeah.
We can take 10 minutes for question, maybe maximum 5 minutes, because we are already late. Yes, we will bring you the mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really, really good overview. Jana Selwood from the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I'm interested if you could expand a little more on the role of the Eurasian Economic Union and what exactly how sanctions have affected that and sort of its role.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, what we're facing is a question of sanctions compliance within what is an established regional legal economic architecture that takes precedent over all other forms of economic affiliation, right? And so the customs union is real, right? And I think there's been a tendency, and everyone, a select few, to sort of dismiss that this is just a paper organization, that it's virtual, it just sort of exists. But actually, this is an economic space. And so what that allows is the re-exporting of goods and Russian firms to set up in Eurasian Economic Union countries and have the ease to do that. Now, what they're not allowed to do, right, is to produce goods and acquire goods on the restricted export list, right? And that's the question about sort of compliance. And I saw Eurasianet piece yesterday about how the Kazakh government is going to redouble its efforts to check through the for re-exports of restricted goods. This is really tough to do, though. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to encourage vertical chains of integration between various countries. And now, in fact, it's the sanctions regime that has given the Eurasian Economic Union a kind of impetus and a purpose that some argue that it didn't have before. Yes, please, in the back.
Thank you.
Yeah, please take the mic also so we're online.
I'm Sebastien from Kyrgyz Republic, private entrepreneur. Where is the red line from your perspective? What bad things my country or our economy should do so that European Union and US put sanctions on us? One example is my friend who is working in Korean company in Bishkek is getting order. That's a Korean company getting order from Russia to produce military uniform. They send request to China because Chinese factory said, "Ruski karavel, we are not going to produce your uniform." And Russia, I don't know, government or Russian company contacted Korean company in Bishkek, pharmaceutical company. Then they ordered from China and resending, but I don't know where they put in army stamp. So where is the red line for sanctioning Central Asian countries or namely Kyrgyzstan?
I think
How close we are to be on sanction? So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I think you illustrated in your remarkable contribution some of the real dilemmas there and some of the real difficulties, right? And I think, the monitoring of this is extremely difficult. OFAC just doesn't have capacity to monitor all this, but you can look at sort of general trends in sectors, make clear to our allies, some of the vertical chains sort of involved, eventually get the message. But, this is a fundamental inside of the political economy smuggling network. For every regime that's put up, you get a reaccommodation and a transformation. And so, I think it becomes a game of, I'm sorry, it's a very kind of culturally specific reference. So like whack-a-mole, right? You sort of get one part and it comes up there. You get this and it comes up there. And I think this is a real life experiment. Now, in terms of where the red lines are, I can't tell you that. I don't know what the enforcement or whether there's going to be a few demonstration effects, certain companies, what exactly sort of the strategy on this. But I think your example illustrates the dilemma very effectively. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you for the presentation. It's excellent to see how such complex narratives have been summarized in such an efficient way. I'm Ulbek Gulamov. I come from Uzbekistan. I work on legal reforms for the government. From what we are seeing, focusing particularly on the last part of understanding opportunities, you're speaking of kind of the political approach, but throughout this narrative, you're talking political plus economic.
Yes.
As you're rightly saying, the major powers in the region have skin in the game economically. And you also see that the countries are, in dire need of foreign direct investment. That's, been kind of spoken in all platforms by Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the rest. What do you see are the opportunities on an economic landscape that can kind of further fuel the political tools that will kind of go hand in hand? And do you see that? Do you look at the economic opportunities in the same way as you do the political?
Yeah, I think it's always a little tempting to think that economic liberalization might also bring sort of political orientation. I think that was a failed experiment, frankly, in Russia. So we saw that. I mean, in some ways, whatever the overall verdict, regardless of certain exceptions and sectors, I think was negative. And I certainly wouldn't favor framing these politically. But I do think by the nature of some of these ecosystems, right, when you're talking about the IT world, right, where the conferences are, what the best practices are, where innovation happens, right, where startup capital comes from, right, people-to-people exchanges, the big conferences, right, the fintech circuit. All of these, I would say, are either in the West or favorably disposed to and engaged with this, right? So I think I wouldn't frame it as a political opportunity, just like I wouldn't frame central banking in political terms. But yes, central banking, it is ideological. It is political. Even saying central bank should be independent and that belief is a political act, right? So it's probably best not framed in that way, because I think it's important for countries' own sakes to develop and court sort of FDI. But I think the ingredients are the same as, you know certainly better than me, through your expertise. It's transparency of rules, a sense of political stability, due process, a helpful legal regime. All of these are important. But what's just sort of struck me again about the IT sector, and their inquiries into this, is how nimble they are, right? Is how quick they are to identify places that they can go, because their startup costs are more about people, right? Those are spaces and equipment. So.
And in that narrative, is there room to put the onus on the West as opposed to the local framework?
I don't think I would. Well, I mean, I think the local framework becomes or isn't attractive to the West, right? I don't think the West can tell its companies go somewhere. We just don't do that, right? And so I think it's inverted, right? If the regimes are attractive, if there are good examples, right, then I think there'll be companies that will view the risk as worthwhile, and they have already. Especially, I'll cite again the Armenian example.
I think unfortunately it will be time for us to stop, and thanks Alex for his wonderful presentation. We will continue discussing relatively similar issues during the first panel, so you will be able to ask your question, but please join me in thanking once again Professor Cooley for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
And I now invite Teresa to join me, and then we will be launching or continuing our discussion and launching our first panel. So good morning, everyone. My name is Marlene Laruelle. I'm the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at UW, hosting the Central Asia program. And our first panel will continue the discussion Professor Cooley launched on the war in Ukraine, perception from and impact on Central Asia. We will have three great presentations. Two of our speakers are online, Nargis, Kassenova, and Paul Stronsky, and then Teresa Sabonis is here with us. So let me immediately give the floor, in fact, to Nargis Kassenova from Harvard University, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Nargis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I wish I could be there in person, especially given that the three of us would be so color coordinated. We will agree. So, okay. Jokes aside, I was asked to talk about the perspectives from Central Asia on the war in Ukraine, and of course, it can be all kinds of perspectives on the questions such as what is the nature of the war, who is to blame, what should the government do?
Sorry, the sound is really not good. Can you try to speak louder or closer to your mic?
Oh, usually. Okay.
I mean, we can hear you, but in the back of the room, it's really very.
Yes.
Okay, is it okay now? Is it better?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so you can talk about all kinds of perspectives, but I'd like to focus on Central Asian official perspectives on the war and give a little bit of depth by making a comparative overview of ways Central Asian policymakers responded to the crisis of 2008. 2014 and the one last year. What I'm interested in is whether we see continuity or change, or continuity and change in these responses. So I will, to some extent, I will echo Professor Cooley's presentation, but my key question is this one: continuity or change, or continuity and change, and we can expect continuity because the core interests of the governments remain. They full-heartedly support the principle of territorial integrity and they denounce separatism. There is also an important interest of the regime stability, which is linked to Russia. And so we can say that vulnerabilities and dependencies of Central Asian regimes and economies vis-a-vis Russia remain. We can also expect continuity because of the geopolitical setting has been more or less stable. Central Asian states continue to see multi-vector foreign policy as the best way to ensure security and development. Russia, China, the West continue to be the three main vectors, maybe not the same size. Well, definitely not the same size, but they are there, which allows the balancing act. Well, Central Asian states benefit from the support given by the West to the sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also the benefit from this kind of support from China. Alex quoted Xi Jinping, what Xi Jinping said last year. But we can also go back to the SCO declaration, the declaration made by heads of states at the Dushanbe summit in August 2008, right in the aftermath of Georgia-Russia war, when Moscow didn't receive the support that it expected, and instead the member states they expressed a concern with the tensions, with the recent tensions around the issue of South Ossetia, and they kind of called for the peaceful way of resolving this issue, and they reconfirmed the kind of the principle of sovereignty. So we also can expect continuity because these are the same people in charge. Takayev, Mirziyoyev, Kamilov, Rahmon, Berdimuhamedov, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan. We might see change since each time there was a jump in the level of Russia's transgression. So 2008, that was the first time Russia directly intervened militarily in another post-Soviet state. 2014, that's redrawing the borders, annexation of Crimea, and well, 2022, we know it's a major land grab and denial of sovereignty. So the predictability of Russia was going down, triggering stronger fears of Russia doing similar things in the region, inciting separatism, annexing parts with the help of its military stationed in the region, and also every time there was a stronger response by the West and the international community. We might also see change, I would say, due to the generational change that is underway. The coming generation of political elites is less Russocentric. It is less tied to Russia, and I think we can see if we look at the pointier, kind of sharper statements by younger officials in Kazakhstan. Turkmenistan is a bit of an outlier, perhaps, and we know that Serdar Bermuhamedov studied in the Russian Diplomatic Academy, and if anything, we see some kind of more leaning toward Russia now in Turkmenistan. So if we look at if we go back to the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, we can say that among Central Asian states, Kazakhstan paid most attention to the conflict for three reasons. The first one, its own fear of separatism. The second being good relations with Georgia. Nazarbayev and Saakashvili had very good relations. They got along very nicely. And Kazakhstan had substantial investments in Georgia and plans to develop the Trans-Caspian corridor together with Georgia. It is estimated that Kazakhstan had something between $700 million and $1 billion investments in Georgia, 100% of Batumi oil terminal, shares in the Tbilisi gas distribution company, hotel, resorts sectors, and Kazakhstan was transported via Georgia. And the third was the Kazakhstan's bid to chair the OSCE at the time. So Nazarbayev's first reaction on the 8th of August, he was in Beijing, and he made some comments critical of the Georgian leadership. But very quickly he walked back, and a week later he gave a more balanced assessment. So he on the 14th of August, he talked about the principle of territorial integrity that is recognized by the entire world community, and that we all have come out against separatism in documents accepted within the framework of the CIS. So we can say that Kazakhstani officials have always stressed the consistency of the country's position. Kazakhstan didn't recognize the North Cyprus, despite good relations with Turkey, didn't recognize Kosovo, despite good relations with the EU and US. And of course, Kazakhstan had to do balancing act, we all do, balance its relations with Russia, with its relations with Georgia, balance its relations with Russia, its relations with the West, and on the, well, basically it was done through some criticism of the West for its one-sided assessment of what happened, and kind of understanding Russia's position, and then appeal to both Russia and the West and all sides involved to refrain from mutual rebukes and threats, and negotiate based on the principles of the international law. Kyrgyzstan at the time had much less to do with Georgia and the other Central Asian states as well, but Kyrgyzstan was heading the CIS Council. And on the 12th of August, President Bakiyev ordered the MFA to start consultations. But CIS didn't do much, couldn't do much, and well, 3 days later, Nazarbayev criticized CIS as an amorphous formation deprived of any tools and mechanisms to settle the conflicts like that in South Ossetia. So Kyrgyzstan took time to formulate its position, called for political solution, and that's what the others did as well. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan kept low profile, Turkmenistan an even lower profile. But if you look at the way Central Asians voted in the UN General Assembly on return of refugees from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, throughout the years, you can see that the four, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, consistently abstain, while Turkmenistan doesn't vote. So Russia-Georgia was the first challenge of the kind, and I would say that kind of formulating a response back then created that modus operandi for responding to the next crisis. So 2014, if we go to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, here we should probably note that it was preceded by Maidan, which is very scary for Central Asian authoritarian leaders. And they saw it as another confirmation of dangers of democratization. And Ukraine is a fairly big economy, so relations with it are important for Central Asian countries. For Kazakhstan, it was also the conflict that took place, the crisis that took place on the eve of the signing of the Eurasian Economic Union Treaty. So the government received plenty of food for thought this regard, and there were some important similarities between Kazakhstan and Ukraine. In Kazakhstan, we also have areas that are considered as part of the historical Russia by some, and the euphoria that Crimea created, the annexation of Crimea created in the Russian society was also quite scary. There was also realization that the Budapest Memorandum doesn't really give anything, doesn't really give much to the countries that signed it, to Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus in terms of security guarantees. So what was Kazakhstan's position? Kazakhstan again took a pause to think. It pretty soon started making statements in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity, but it needed to give something to Russia as well, and to react to the referendum. And on the 18th of March, Kazakh MFA issued a position that Kazakhstan sees the referendum in Crimea as a free expression of the will of the people and understands Russia's position, but this statement didn't mention the inclusion of Crimea into the Russian Federation and called for the resolution of the conflict with the participation of the United Nations. We see a similar dynamic in Uzbekistan. In March, Uzbek MFA made two statements, and they were quite generic. So the Republic of Uzbekistan, proceeding from the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and the norms of international law, firmly and invariably adheres to the position on resolving emerging international disputes by peaceful means, refraining international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Again, if we look at the vote, we see that on Crimea, there was an important vote on the 27th of March, and well, there was a vote on Ukraine's territorial integrity. We see Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan abstaining, while the others not showing up for the vote. So 2022, it's fresh. Well, invasion of Ukraine is fresh in everybody's mind. For some context, we remember the January events in Kazakhstan, the CSTO intervention. That was the year when they were expecting elections in Uzbekistan. The year before, there was a turmoil in Kyrgyzstan and border conflict on Kyrgyz-Uzbek border. There was US troops withdrawal from Afghanistan. So the governments of the region were quite nervous.
Can I ask you
to sum up? Yes. So quite nervous and insecure. And I don't have time to go over, but I think everybody knows how Kazakhstan reacted, how Uzbekistan reacted. There was no recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk republics. There was assertion of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. There were votes of abstention, and the four countries, with the exception, of course, of Turkmenistan, abstained in the UN General Assembly vote. So there was this position of neutrality. I can elaborate more on that if there are questions, but basically to sum it up, do we see continuity or change? We do see a lot of continuity of the pattern that emerged in response to the Russia-Georgia war. Countries are trying to preserve sovereignty, assert the principle of territorial integrity, and they call for peaceful resolution. They express understanding of Russia as much as they can. However, we do see some change as well, and we see, I think, a stronger push for regionalization led by Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And we see a little bit like the beginning, I think, of the generational change as well. And here, I would say Kazakhstan is ahead of the curve. So I'll stop here because I'm already over time.
Thank you so much, Nargis, for this great presentation. I now would like to give the floor to Paul Stronsky from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, discussing the impact of the war on Central Asian economy and Russian investment in Central Asia.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I apologize. I'm just sitting in a place where I'm supposed to be wearing a mask. So if you see me put it on, it's because I got called out by someone. But I think you'll probably hear me a little bit better because it's a little bit noisy here as well. I'm going to talk both about sort of the economic impacts of Russia's investment, but I also kind of want to start picking up where Nargis and Professor Cooley ended. And I think this war has really brought unwelcome shocks to Central Asia and the broader Eurasian region. I think the Ukraine precedent was a clear warning shot to all of Russia's neighbors of Russia's willingness to use more than its hybrid powers, its political, cultural tactics, its Eurasian integration agenda to shore up its influence in the region. And I think this, is clear. Russia is fearing that its power is declining across Eurasia. And in Central Asia, we've seen, particularly by the next generation, as Nargis mentioned, a cultural turn away from Moscow. Some of those desires to promote integration or to go along with integration have stalled. Particularly in Uzbekistan, Central Asian governments don't only see themselves as tied to China or Russia, but also to Afghanistan and South Asia overall. And we see the growing economic and political power of China as well as others. So while we I think Moscow is now clearly showing that it has no hesitancy to use kinetic power against its neighbors. And I think we should also note that many of the same rhetorical threats that senior Kremlin officials used against Ukraine, they've used against other states, Kazakhstan in particular, but also several other ones in the broader region. Now, I think we need to be very humble in how we predict the future. I think when we started 2022, we saw the deployment of the CSTO to Kazakhstan. It was an initial indication of Russia's willingness to act swiftly and decisively. Looking back, I now wonder whether that was more of a smokescreen for the coming invasion of Ukraine, but it was handled much more deftly. And since then, the CSTO, to me, appears in crisis. It's unable to act, lots of friction. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and I think Alex Cooley was right to highlight also Armenia, because you really see the dysfunction of that organization there. And another reason, I think, is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the difficulties it's had there with command and control, morale, over-centralization of decision-making, communications, the poor performance of Russian military equipment in particular, was another wake-up call. So not only is Russia no longer a predictable neighbor, but a revanchist one, but there are questions now about its caliber and capability as an ally and a military equipment and defense provider. And I would argue that the war is really hastening the arrival of multipolarity, to the broader region, to Central Asia in particular. This is certainly on the foreign policy and security front. Central Asia doesn't want to be stuck between a revanchist Russia and a economically far more powerful China. There is a push now to diversify its foreign policy and defense policies. And clearly on the defense industry, given the problems Russia is facing in resupplying itself, we are seeing a turn towards other partners, whether that's going to be China, Turkey, Iran, India. I think you're seeing all of them play a little bit of a more assertive role. But Central Asia also wants to diversify its economic partners as much as possible. The U.S. and the EU are certainly showing some interest, but I think I'll just be blunt. We all know about the staying power of the United States and the European Union in this region. Our track record is not great. Turkey is certainly asserting itself using Azerbaijan first and foremost as a way to reach out, but also the Organization of Turkic States, and Turkish defense industry is really hot right now across the region. But we're also seeing some new entrants. India is certainly stepping up. We're seeing the Gulf states, particularly in some renewable projects. And as Nargis said, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan both see regional integration as important. And I think it is important to create an attractive market, but also to push back at Russia and China. But I'm not quite sure the regional integration agenda is fully aligned, and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are fully aligned. So I think we're seeing some dramatic shifts in the region, but I'm really not 100% sure whether this is going to last. As I noted, we need to be humble in what we think. 2022 wasn't what we expected. If you look at the economy, everybody thought the economy was going to be devastated in this region, but the IMF claimed that growth in the region was about 4.7% growth versus the 2.6% that they initially said that they thought it was going to be. I think the reason for this impact, as Professor Cooley mentioned, the Russian contraction due to sanctions was not as severe as everyone expected. There is strong economic, financial, and sort of just how you do transactions between Central Asia and Moscow. We saw a tremendous boom in cross-border transfers. The countries of Central Asia benefited from sustained remittances, but also from a large amount of capital flight. I think we've seen a lot of that money go in. Where that money goes once it gets to Central Asia is not quite clear to me. Some of it is moving out of Central Asia, some of it is being invested, but we are certainly seeing this pattern, and I think it helped the Central Asian economies. And then we have the sanctions and parallel trade issue. Not everything that's going through to Russia is sanctionable. Some of the stuff is, Gucci bags that are no longer being sold by Gucci in Russia. But there is certainly sanctions evasion. And what I think is important to highlight is that what happened over the past year with the economy may not repeat itself. This could be a one-time immediate impact of the war, or it could be prolonged. So I think we need to be really kind of circumspect to sort of see whether this is a long-term economic shift or more of a short one. And whether these countries will continue to prove resilient. This, I think, is because there is increasingly and there's significant uncertainty in the Ukraine war. We don't know where that war is going. We don't know how sanctions will be stepped up. We don't know how they will be enforced. I think we've heard some clear signs that they will enforcement will be stepped up, but stepping up enforcement is also quite challenging. Anybody who's worked in the U.S. government should know that. But I also think the uncertainty in the war, Professor Cooley mentioned, and I fully agree, Putin should be indicted for war crimes. But I also wonder how that is going to affect the war in Ukraine as well, and will Russia just double down? Putin has no way out now. I don't think he wanted a way out, but I really fear that the oligarchs, the people around Putin, also are going to fear about an indictment, and it's all or nothing at this point. So I think the West has certainly stepped up the costs, and Russia might step up the costs in the war as well. So that also highlights a couple other things. How is the war going to impact and sanctions, how they're going to impact the Russian economy over the next year? It's proven far more resilient, but again, is that a one-off, particularly as we lose a little bit of our patience with countries that are helping Moscow evade sanctions. And I think, will the cross-border capital flight continue, or has Central Asia gotten all the money it's going to get? And where is that money being invested? I do think it's great, and I agree with all of the figures about the growth of IT. I think that's a really promising industry, but it also it's a very specialized one for people who are highly educated. And I think what we need to sort of look at is what other Russians, what other companies are coming in, creating economic opportunities, creating production, creating jobs, how many of these IT jobs are actually local IT jobs, and how many of them are transplants. I think these are all the things we really need to know to see whether we're going to see this boom, this economic boom coming to the future. So I think, a couple things, quick things. We've certainly seen, Russian money flows. We've certainly seen some Russian investment. I don't think this region has really seen what it hoped. I also am a little bit concerned. Every single country seems to want to have an IT industry of its own. There's a lot of competition for that now, and which ones will succeed. I'm also, other challenges remain. I think we are seeing some backtracking on the reform agenda across the region, on the economic and political reform agenda. We're seeing inflation remaining quite high, and we're seeing a lot more geoeconomic fragmentation that's impeding trade, it's impeding supply chains, regional cooperation, and even, a couple of years ago, everybody in Central Asia was focused on the BRI and the sort of the northern route of the BRI. That's kind of stalled right now. And so what are the new trade outlets, and how will those issues develop? So I think we're 1 year in, but we're far from really knowing how this is going to play out economically as well as politically for the Central Asian states. And with that, I'll turn it to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this great presentation. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Teresa Sabodis-Held from Georgetown University, discussing Central Asian energy and the Ukraine war.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand. One of the advantages of being in person is I don't have to sit down. So I want to talk today particularly about the energy lens. You want me to stay up here? Okay. I'm going to talk today, focus particularly on the energy lens. And before we can really talk about Central Asia, there's a not intuitive point about European energy security that I want to call your attention to. So bearing in mind that Ukraine is home to the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and that the Zaporizhzhia facility is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, I want to remind you that Russian troops took over control of both Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia early in the war. Russia returned control of the Chernobyl disused facility at the end of March, but Zaporizhzhia remains a site of fighting, and that fighting has actually caused the International Atomic Energy Agency to recommend closure of Zaporizhzhia. And so Zaporizhzhia has been closed. Now, all of that sounds like just a sort of madness, salted earth strategy that Russia's pursuing. In fact, it isn't. And I want to call your attention to how this connects to the broader war and why I consider this the first major crisis of the energy transition. It turns out that Ukraine has been trying to join the European energy community since 2011, and the European energy community was eager to have them. Ukraine has long been on track to join European energy before the Baltic states, which if you just think about European solidarity makes no sense. But Ukraine was under great encouragement to disconnect from the existing electricity grids and connect to the European grid. And in fact, this was well underway before the war. The last test that you have to pass to join ENTSO-E, the European grid, is you have to sever connections to all other electricity grids and prove that your country can stand alone, can keep the lights on for a week. Then you rejoin your old grids, you go through legal proceedings, and you can within a year join ENTSO-E. Ukraine was on schedule to do its standalone test the last week of February 2022. And even though there were troops massing on the border, even though the invasion was already unfolding, Ukraine did that. And they stood alone and immediately appealed to ENTSO-E and said, these are conditions of war. Please let us in early. Don't make us wait a year. ENTSO-E debated for a month and then connected Ukraine to the European grid. And the thing that most people don't understand that is actually very important for my argument here is that from the end of March 2022 until the forced closure of Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine was a significant exporter of electricity to Europe. Even under conditions of war, they were blunting the impact of Russian sanctions because Ukraine has surplus nuclear electricity. And in the larger European grid, that electricity was a very important aspect of blunting the sanctions. So forcing the closure of Zaporizhzhia both created economic pressure on the Ukrainian government because they were deriving significant revenue from it, and made Ukraine a liability in European energy rather than an asset. So it's important to understand this. Now, why did the European Union want Ukraine badly enough to work with Ukraine through this electricity transition for 10 years? The answer is the European Union is trying to lead the energy transition, and they have actually embraced a commitment to move increasingly towards electricity. If you don't think about electricity systems, you might imagine that just replacing conventional energy with renewable energy was what Europe is trying to do. No, Europe is trying to move right now in the United States, also in Europe. We use about 20% of the energy that we use is used in the form of electricity. The goal is to shift that to 50%. So in every part of the world that's doing a major transition, the goal is not only to change how the sources of electricity come, but how a country uses energy. So everyone is moving to try to use more electricity. If you're trying to double how much of your energy you use in the form of electricity, you're massively increasing your grids. At the same time, you're changing the inputs to those grids. And so a country like Ukraine that is nuclear friendly, that has surplus nuclear power, that has fairly well-developed grids, becomes extremely important to this kind of a transition. So Europe was really eager to have Ukrainian nuclear in the mix because the grid has to grow at the same time you're trying to transition it. And so Russia had a real reason to want to prevent Ukraine from being an asset to European Union energy. But of course, as you probably know, Ukraine is not Europe's only nuclear option. There are nuclear power plants in 15 of the 27 European Union states. And Romania has signed contracts to build new small modular reactors. Poland and Hungary are pursuing new nuclear. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for nuclear. And in fact, during this war, Europe has changed its official stance and has defined nuclear energy as the long-term future contribution to European energy. But European nuclear, even without Ukraine, has a Russia problem. 18 of the reactors in the European Union were Soviet or Russian built. 4 of the ones that are new or under construction are Russia built. And Europe is importing most of its nuclear fuel from Russia. Now, this is a particularly concerning issue because there are only 4 countries in the world until recently that have a well-developed capability to enrich uranium: France, Canada, Russia, and China. And here's where things get interesting and tie back to Central Asia. The largest exporter of uranium in the world is Kazakhstan. But the supply chains that have developed have Kazakhstan exporting raw uranium and yellowcake to Russia, where it is refined, and then Russia exports it. Now, bear in mind, this is not only a European problem. The United States imports 28% of its enriched fuel from Russia. The European Union imports the majority of its fuel from Russia. So what we saw is that there was a kind of Soviet-style vertical integration that put Russia right there as part of the nuclear supply chain. And that has begun to change. A year ago in December, China and Russia jointly constructed a new facility for enrichment of uranium in Kazakhstan. In December of this past year, the first major shipment of low enriched uranium went from Kazakhstan to China. Now, this is important because China owns 50% of the facility, but it's also important because Kazakhstan now has a demonstrated capacity to enrich its own uranium. Russia is still involving itself in some pieces of this chain, but not only Kazakhstan, but all of the nuclear consuming world realizes that a 5th power is needed that can produce enriched uranium, and ideally it would be a country that has uranium. So this is a role where Kazakhstan plays a logical role. As Professor Cooley was saying, a lot of networks are being repurposed, but physical infrastructure doesn't repurpose quite as well as networks. And Russia has really been abusing the physical infrastructure from the Kazakh perspective. And so what we see is the possible rising of a new one of what Professor Stronsky described as very specialized technology, but this is important. In the nuclear industry, it creates jobs. It gives Kazakhstan a vision of where it fits in next generation energy. And now the question becomes, what's the route? If you're going to make fuel rods in Kazakhstan, how do you get them out? There's still obviously a lot of quiet debate and contention about this, but I would call your attention to the fact that for reasons that are otherwise not obvious, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency was yesterday in Turkmenistan. What does that suggest? It suggests that multiple routes are being considered, but one of them would be to make use of the port of Turkmenbashi, which is dramatically underutilized, which moves the export route further away from Russia, and which is a possible export route. But what the travel Director General Grossi suggests is that we're actively trying to figure out what would be the delivery route. Now, it is true that the United States is trying to carve a role for itself in all of this. Westinghouse is now supplying the fuel rods to all of Ukraine, but it's not doing a good job. The failure rate of Westinghouse rods is oddly high. And again, Westinghouse, because the United States does not have a facility that enriches uranium, having Westinghouse in the chain, Westinghouse will be a partner, but it's got to be based somewhere. All right. So this has the potential of being a new one of those wormhole networks. And all of you are wondering why on earth I'm talking about nuclear and not at all about the other transit corridors that we dream of. So I want to end with talking about some of the short corridors. Kazakhstan has historically used CPC. It's a route, it's the only privately held oil pipeline that goes across Russian territory. It was so successful for so many years that against all odds, the investors were expanding the route. And then the war in Ukraine started. And every time that Kazakhstan has talked to Europe about getting more oil to Europe, Russia has imposed some delays and slowdowns on the pipeline of the CPC. This has reinforced Kazakhstan's desire to think about alternate routes. So far, the oil has not been sanctioned, but there's a complicated way that it has to be proven that it is Kazakh oil for it to keep flowing. And this gives Russia some leverage. There was also a desire to expand the pipeline this year. That's not going forward, as you might have imagined, on plan. Tokayev has reordered an investigation of the feasibility of a pipeline that would go to Azerbaijan. This is possible because Azerbaijan's production of oil is declining, but the infrastructure does exist. The project was reviewed before the war and was considered canceled. It has been revitalized, but of course, the big new unknown for any Trans-Caspian pipelines has to do with Nord Stream 2. Some evidence suggests that it was actors loyal to Kyiv. Some evidence suggests that it was actors loyal to the Kremlin, but we used to think of underwater infrastructure as being inherently quite secure, and the destruction of Nord Stream 2 has really called that into question. So now in considering building any new routes, you have to add a whole new security consideration that didn't used to be there, which adds to the cost. Of course, there has long been some dream of doing something Trans-Caspian. The Trans-Caspian issue remains very much in doubt because of the delicate indecision of the Berdimuhamedov's administration and the concern that they have. In the short term, what has happened, some people misspeak and say that we're using LNG in the Caspian. We are not. We're using compressed natural gas. So tankers that take gas and jam 24 times as much gas into the same space are transiting the Caspian. But the difference between compressed natural gas, 24 times as much, and LNG, 600 times as much, is hugely different, speaks very much to volume. So the volumes across involving Turkmenistan will remain very low unless there is pipeline infrastructure. Again, China is willing to take some extra, but right now China is enjoying low-cost imports from Russia. So many of the routes from Central Asia to China are not getting a lot of attention right now. The thing that we have to keep close attention to is that all these transit corridors, oil, gas, and uranium, are going to have to go through the Caucasus as well. And so what I have been watching closely, what I encourage you to watch closely, is what's going on particularly in Azerbaijan, in Georgia. There is a possibility that routes would have to go through Turkey again to avoid as much of the Black Sea as possible, given instability in the Black Sea. But remember that any corridors serving Europe are going to involve a complex physical network that is not being repurposed, it's being completed. And this middle corridor has gotten more and more important. And now we're looking at it not only hopefully for oil and gas, but also hopefully for uranium.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And we have now about 20 minutes for our discussion. There are some questions on the online crowd, but let's begin by a round of questions here in the room. I see you're in the back. Wait for the mic and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for the very informative presentation and emphasizing the role of Azerbaijan. My name is Sanan Shabanov. I'm from Azerbaijan and participating in CONCAP program by Rumsfeld Foundation in DC. My question is about one project initiated recently, which you didn't cover in your presentation. It is Black Sea submarine project, submarine cable project, which initiated by the European Union, Hungary, Romania, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Some analytics, some experts, they call it second BTC or BTC of green energy. Some experts are very excited about this project. Even the European Union not approved, but earmarked 2.3 billion euro for the implementation and realization of this project. Of course, in Azerbaijan, people, especially in media or pro-government media, they talk about it. Again, we might have biased opinion as a locals. As an expert from your standpoint, I would like to ask your opinion, potential, or what's the potential of this project, and to what extent it might play or can play some role in energy security of European Union. Thank you once again for the presentation.
Thank you. Maybe let's collect questions. Do we have in the room? I have some in the chat. So 2 questions. One about the Kazakhstan military industrial complex and how it is dealing with the situation now. Do we know how the military cooperation with Russia, because this Kazakh military industrial complex is very much connected to the Russia one. So what is happening in that field? And another question about Kazakhstan also role in helping or supporting the Russian banking system, like having Alpha Bank and Sberbank being kind of partly relocated or moving to Kazakhstan. So if some of our 3 speakers could also address this question. Maybe let's begin with the energy question, Teresa, when we are in the room, and then can see for the 2 others.
Is this on or do I?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, so the Black Sea cable, for those of you who, hold on, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's for the energy.
So the Black Sea cable, the idea here is that Georgia is the only member that has fulfilled all the obligations of the energy community and yet has no physical connection directly to the energy community. So to serve Georgia's security and to broaden the European electricity grid, the idea is to build the undersea cable connecting. It is technically possible, although the military condition on the Black Sea right now leaves it as a project for the future. The key uncertainty financially is that neither Romania nor Georgia at the present time have significant surplus electricity. So you can build it as a security measure, but you're not likely to move it to the front of the line until you understand the economic interest. This is why Azerbaijan has gotten very excited about the Black Sea cable, because Azerbaijan is the chief exporter of electricity now to Georgia, and they expect that they can further expand their electricity. The challenge here is that Europe is most interested in green electricity, so they'd be much more eager to have the Georgian hydropower produced electricity, which is not in surplus. It is a possible project. I do believe that in a 10-year future, it is going to be an attractive project. I do think it enhances security. But given the market uncertainties and the chaotic state of the Black Sea right now, there will be no new infrastructure built involving the Black Sea until the status of the put into question by the war is resolved.
Nargis and Paul, would you like to take one of the two other questions on the Kazakh military industrial complex and the kind of banking outsourcing, Russian banking outsourcing in Kazakhstan?
Oh, but actually, can I add one note on the, there is also a fiber optic cable across the Caspian, Trans-Caspian fiber optic cable project. And I think last year, Kazakh Telecom and Azer Telecom signed an agreement to build the cable. On the military cooperation, I think it proceeds. You know, the Kazakhstan-Russia military cooperation proceeds. They basically, I think both sides try to keep the situation as normal as possible, keep the status quo, and there are new agreements signed, and there is a cooperation in the area of education, joint training, all these things are going on. At the same time, Kazakhstan is kind of trying to build up its own capacity. So there are I'm not an expert on military issues, but that's what you kind of read in the news. So as you probably know, it is the Kazakh politician Tasmagambeda, who is head of the CSTO, General Secretary of the Collective Security Treaty Organization at this point. So I think kind of the attempt is, in a nutshell, the attempt is to keep it kind of as normal as possible, because you cannot decouple there overnight. That's for sure. And I'm not sure there is an intention to do it either.
What would you like to add?
Yeah, I would agree that I don't think there is an intention to fully decouple. I do think that Kazakhstan and many other of the countries that are highly dependent on Russian arms and are contributing to the Russians' arm industry need to think carefully about that. Components certainly going north that are from Kazakhstan are certainly troubling to the international community and to the West. But we're also seeing, I don't know particularly for all of the Central Asian countries, but I do know I was in Armenia not long ago, and they are not getting the weapons that they've actually purchased from the Russians, and that is happening elsewhere. I just actually have the data on that. So you are definitely seeing a broader outreach specifically to Turkey. Everybody wants Bayraktar drones now, and that technology to be able to make it in-house. And we are also seeing the Indians step up a little bit. They also, make components that can be used in Russian equipment. So you're seeing some of these countries, since Russia can't supply it anymore, or their fears of doing business, they're starting to look elsewhere. And on sort of Alpha Bank, I mean, these are the things that we have to be looking at, and these are the big dilemmas and the big discussions that I think are happening between the U.S. government, the State Department, Treasury Department, and their counterparts in Kazakhstan.
Thank you. We have time for a second round of questions. I have some questions in the chat, and then some are coming here. So, sir, in the third row.
Yeah. Thank you for presentations. I have two questions. Sorry. My name is Kozmho from the Embassy of Uzbekistan. My question is about energy sector. Is two questions. First one about the renewable energies. In terms of the crisis and last winter, the countries of region are mostly interested in growing up the renewable energies, and they are doing several things in this term. But the presence of West companies are less because that we see that Qatar, China companies are making joint venture in the region and starting production renewable energy technologies. Do you see interest of Western companies? Maybe they also will be interested coming to the region to helping the region to boost the renewable energy. Do you see this possible? And second one about uranium and reaching the uranium. You mentioned about Kazakhstan, but Uzbekistan also has the very rich reserves of the uranium. Currently, country do not enrich and sell it as the for using of the in nuclear plants. But maybe you mentioned Westinghouse may be interested in this. Do you see possibility of making joint venture in this term with Westinghouse and Uzbekistan companies?
Thank you. One more question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Muhibbullah Nouri. I am a regional integration activist and founder of an organization called Heart of Asia Nations Integration Movement. My question is referred to the poll that indicated to the regional integration. I see here there is no regional integration policy, or the US is not supporting a regional integration policy in the region. Their position is that they are supporting independence of the sovereignty and the independence of the country in the region. What do you think about regional integration and possibilities of regional integration between the Central Asian and Caucasus countries, Afghanistan and Mongolia? Is there a possibility? Especially there is many regional organizations in Asia that it is centered to the regional power like China or Russia, and there is no independent regional organization that created by this small countries of region. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we have one question more on uranium, one on regional integration, and maybe I read two questions from the chat. That would make 4 questions, and we can do a last round to give for our speakers to comment. One question was on
Renewable energy.
yeah. Sorry, I lost one of.
Oh, she's looking at the chat.
This one. Yeah, sorry. One question about if Russia is finding itself at least partly in isolation, how does that impact Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Belt and Road Initiative? So kind of big China question. And another question, maybe more for Nargis. When we look at the kind of equilibrium of the Central Asian state toward Russia in the war, what is the part of kind of regime strategies and what is the part of the kind of public opinion, local public opinion pressure? For example, in Kazakhstan, do we consider that part of the public opinion is kind of like pro-Ukrainian, and that forced the regime to be kind of playing on both sides? So is there any kind of domestic impact of the public opinion on the regime strategic balance, or is that just the regime make that kind of equilibrium by itself? So let's go over maybe Teresa.
All right, on the point of renewable energy, it is true that China and UAE are leading in Central Asia. Bear in mind that China is leading in the world in renewable energy, in terms particularly in solar. Germany has been very active in doing international development of solar, but they're at a particular disadvantage right now. The main disadvantage for Europe about renewable energy is that it has a very high upfront cost and then maintenance cost is low. But Europe has been in an energy crisis now for a year, and that crisis has driven the price of energy so high that states are being overwhelmed by the subsidies they're extending to their own citizens to keep the lights on and to keep industry manufacturing. So I believe that within the end of the war, there's going to be a huge leap forward, just as there was after the 73 and 79 crises, in efficiency and in new technology. But new technologies that have a high upfront cost are hard to embrace at a moment when you're already in crisis. And so we've seen that although Germany has led Europe in doing investing in other economies in renewables, Germany is lagging right now. That's why you see the leadership of China and UAE. The United States has fallen behind pretty significantly in renewable energy, which is why it features heavily in the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. The United States is trying to embrace an industrial policy to move forward. I don't know that we will lead with international development of renewable energy. I think we're trying to revitalize our own industry before we reach out to the rest of the world. But I do think Central Asia has huge possibilities for renewable energy. I think they're exciting possibilities. In terms of Uzbekistan's uranium, you are correct that they have great potential. What I don't know, because I haven't looked at the uranium sector in the region, whether it makes more sense for Uzbekistan to enrich or for Uzbekistan to cooperate with Kazakhstan in enrichment. And that's a question that I'm pretty sure is of great interest to Director General Grossi right now. And finally, in terms of regional policies in the BRI, bear in mind that the Middle Corridor, which was initially, China did a lot of investment in that, it was identified by the UN before the BRI as a set of critical infrastructure. And in that instance, China took off the shelf a bunch of projects that the UN had endorsed and moved them forward. And that corridor is progressing, it is important. BRI itself, however, has dropped lower in the Chinese Communist Party's priorities. It only received 2 mentions in the big launch of the 5-year plan, which was somewhat shocking considering how important it had been before. And that has to do with the structures of debt that have unfolded associated with BRI, not with Central Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teresa. Paul, maybe? And
Yeah, just on the BRI to sort of pick up on that. One thing we are seeing, we've seen the northern route of the BRI has, I wouldn't say it's ground to a halt, but it's definitely not moving as much as it was all the way to Europe. You're still seeing a lot of things going from China through Central Asia into Russia, so that's still there. But going all the way to Belarus and then into Poland is not happening. I think that is reiterated interest and the political will for that middle corridor. I think Europe is looking at it. China, doesn't have the money it did, and as Dr. Sporna's Health mentioned, it's kind of de-emphasized that, but Turkey is also, clearly a driving force. So its prospects look better, but they're not assured. And then on the regional integration issue, I would actually argue that the U.S. is actually pushing that. Yes, we want these countries to be sovereign, and we want to help these countries maintain their sovereignty, particularly against revanchist powers or powers that can, dominate their economies. But I think a lot of what we've seen since the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the current administration, whether it's the C5+1, there is certainly a desire to use the United States as a convening platform and as a convener to try to jumpstart some of these discussions. There is a clear understanding in Washington that these are small markets, and individually they don't matter that much, but together they are more resilient. And I think there is an understanding, kind of like in the 1990s when the U.S. was engaging in the Balkans, everything was focused in on country specific, and then in the 2000s it became much more of a regional integration prospect because those countries' sovereignty was assured. And I would sort of argue that the United States thinks regional integration is a key step now in making sure that this region remains independent and sovereign and has its own ability to choose its foreign policy, economic policy choices. So I would disagree on that a little bit. Thanks.
thank you, Paul. Nargis?
Yes, well, first I will echo Paul and would also disagree. Well, I would agree with Paul that the US has been supporting regional cooperation, in Central Asia since the beginning, since the early 90s. And we remember that Centrasbat program that was supported by the US and NATO countries. There have been many programs to support economic cooperation in the region. Now there is a very substantial program run by USAID to support energy transition in Central Asia. So that's something that has been supported by the US, by the EU and some other actors. Well, I will not talk about, I don't think regional integration is really on the agenda. What we are kind of hoping will happen is proper regional cooperation in Central Asia. And I would say every crisis sort of gives this push toward regional cooperation. So when the Soviet Union, kind of collapsed, that was the first reaction of Central Asian leaders to get together in Ashgabat and decide what to do next. In the aftermath of Russia-Georgia war, the kind of, we see some aligning as well. 2014, again, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan start working more together, and actually that's late Karimov when the relations warmed up and kind of Tashkent and Astana started working together. And again, we see this push with the war in Ukraine, and for that, basically, you need to have Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan on board, and we see that Kyrgyzstan usually aligns as well. Tajikistan is a bit an outlier, and Turkmenistan is even more kind of traditionally aloof. But I think that there is a promise. I wouldn't be kind of excessively optimistic, but I think now that the incentive is stronger. So let's see what happens if Astana and Tashkent find a way of working together. They can bring also Kyrgyzstan is on board, and hopefully Tajikistan will be on board as well. There is a constraint of different regionalization projects in the region, right? There is the Central Asia one. Then of course there is a Russia-led cooperation integration. Actually, there we do talk about integration. It is under a lot of pressure now. The Eurasian Economic Union, Eurasian economic integration, but we do see reformatting. If anything, Central Asia is more important, is becoming more important for Russia in economic sense and political sense, and security as well. So then there is a Turkey-led cooperation. That's the Organization of Turkic States, which excludes Tajikistan, right? And that connects the region to Azerbaijan and then to Turkey. So it's sort of there are different regionalization processes that are taking place. Now, a very good question on Kazakhstan and equilibrium between regime strategies and public opinion. I would say there is more polarization when we look at public opinion. I think here in the West, we notice more the kind of pro-Ukrainian positions, and definitely they are strong. They are quite substantial, but the public opinion is divided. We just maybe hear less people who sympathize with Russia, who think that Russia is doing the right thing. There is less polarization inside the government. How to proceed and what the approach should be. So it's a bit difficult to kind of to talk about the equilibrium, but I think for now it's good that there is no polarization inside the government. I think that's very important, and maybe the fact that we didn't have this kind of active, how to say, like party politics, that allowed to have a very consistent position, I would say.
Thank you so much. Well, with that, it will be time for us already to conclude this first panel. I think that was a really great kind of in-depth analysis of the impact of the war in Ukraine over the region. And after the coffee break, we will be going back to what Professor Cooley was mentioning at the beginning, that the region had been several exogenous shocks to deal with. And the Taliban one has been one that we tend to have forgotten too fast with the Ukrainian one, but it's a big one seen from the region. And we will be discussing that after the break. We will have like 20 minutes coffee break, but before that, please join me in thanking our three panelists for their wonderful presentation.